The presence of foreign troops in Iraq is to the detriment of the country. The occupation forces must leave Iraq promptly because every single day of delay will harm the nation. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. We are discussing whether the United States really is going to leave Iraq after all that blood and treasure with George Joffrey, Richard Schmierer, and Saeed Mirandi. Saeed Mirandi, let me read you a little quote from President Obama at his speech at Camp Lejeune. He says, "The United States will pursue principled and sustained engagement with all the nations in the region, and that will include Iran and Syria." What Obama is telling Tehran, perhaps, is that if you misbehave in Iraq, then perhaps the goodwill from the United States is off the table. Did you perceive it that way? Is Iran looking at it that perhaps Iraq is a testing ground for U.S. goodwill towards Tehran?
Well, first, I think I have to clarify something that I said earlier that I think you may have misunderstood. When I said that Iran will keep up the pressure against the United States in Iraq, its presence, I meant diplomatically, and the statement that was said before by Ayatollah Khamenei reflects that. The Iranian government has always had close relations with the Iraqi government, and they have never accused Iran of being a part of any or supporting death squads or anything like that. And that was basically, I think, propaganda on behalf of opponents of Iran, such as the United States. I think that really it's the United States that has misbehaved in Iraq, according in the eyes of the Iranian people. After all, they have occupied the country. They imposed sanctions on Iraq for a decade, killing a million people directly or indirectly through the sanctions. And they supported Saddam Hussein's ruthless regime during the 80s. And I think the Iranians really expect the Americans to unclench their fists before they can step forward. I think the Iranians are going to wait and see if the Americans are going to change their policies and attitude. If they do, I think the Iranians are quite willing to move forward as well.
What interests us here, Richard, is what President Obama said, and that is all combat forces and all combat actions, perhaps by the end of August of next year, will cease. In that case, let me throw you a hypothetical case. Let's suppose that an Iraqi general one day got up and toppled the government, let's say al-Maliki's government. Will U.S. forces in Iraq stand idly by watching? Will they interfere in internal Iraqi affairs, or will they spring forward with a military action?
Well, Jassim, obviously I can't speculate on what might happen under various hypothetical scenarios. As you know, our forces currently are there under the security agreement, which was signed by the Iraqi government and ratified by the Iraqi Council of Representatives. And those are both democratically elected elements. So we feel that our presence there to support Iraq in its security needs is legitimate and obviously is there to help Iraqis. The President then has laid out how that support will continue going forward. And it will continue to target in very specific ways with Iraqi security force leadership the kinds of terrorist and extremist elements that are still operating in the country. But the main mission in August 2010 will transition to one of supporting the Iraqi security forces in their development and in their increasing their own capabilities. So I think it's a very reasonable and I think a very good plan.
As a diplomat, I did not expect you to answer that anyway, Richard, but let me ask George.
Thank you, Jassim.
Since the President mentioned al-Qaeda several times in his speech, do you think American forces will launch military attacks outside Iraq from Iraq?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, they have done so only a few months ago into Syria, and that provoked an almighty row, particularly with the Iraqi government that disowned the attack. That means, I think, that the United States will be fairly careful if it feels it must do that again. But I'm quite certain that American forces in Iraq will not be deterred by the anger of the Iraqi government if they feel it necessary. In the same way as President Obama has authorized predator attacks inside Pakistan, even though that destabilizes Pakistan, for the sake of trying to guarantee American forces in Afghanistan, the same must apply in Iraq. And therefore, to an extent, the assumption about American forces simply being there in a supporting role is undermined by the necessity for their own security and by this objective, which is really a continuation of the Bush administration's policies of trying to counter and destroy al-Qaeda should it appear inside Iraq.
I'll take a short comment from Richard. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, as I say, our presence there is for providing security to Iraq within Iraq, and I would not speculate.
But what does that mean, Richard? What does that mean? Security in Iraq for Iraq. What does that mean?
Well, the security challenges that Iraq faces currently are internal to Iraq. There are extremists and terrorists, there are criminals, there are others who are undermining security in Iraq, even though security has gotten much, much better. And so clearly our focus and our efforts is on providing security for Iraq from within Iraq, and that's basically what our mission is.
Said Mirandi, is
Richard,
there
I wonder if I could ask you
Go
a
ahead,
question. Sorry, Jassim. I just wonder if I could ask you a question in that respect, because quite apart from those particular threats, there are other threats from factional infighting. Mr. Maliki, for example, has now become much more muscular against the al-Hakim groups. There's the question of the Kurds. The Sunnis too have their tensions. There's the question of the Awakening Council groups. Now, were that to spill over into violence, what would the attitude be of American forces inside Iraq?
Well, see, again, that would be a hypothetical, and the good news is that all of these elements, who all have their own agendas and their own goals, are pursuing them through the democratic process. They're pursuing them through discussion
including
and compromise.
al-Sadr?
Well, he did participate in the elections, and so there is the indication that even he is prepared to pursue his goals from within the democratic process. So I think we, but not only we, I think all of Iraq's friends, Iraq's neighbors, those who wish Iraq well, want to encourage all of those elements.
Since you mentioned Iraq
they want
neighbors,
to encourage those elements
let me ask
to
Said
continue
Mirandi.
to work within the democratic process.
Said Mirandi, George mentioned the American attack against Syria. Is there an apprehension, fear, or even concern that sometimes in the near future, for any reason, that the United States might launch a military attack against Iran?
I don't think that in Iran people feel concerned about that. The situation on the ground in Iraq has changed. The United States is in serious economic trouble, and Iran is far more powerful and capable of defending itself today than it was a few years ago. I think that the United States
all the more reason, perhaps,
really
people think as the combat mission ends at the end of August, then Iran will be at liberty, since those forces will be diminished, to start supporting its proxies.
I don't think that would be the case, and I don't think that's Iran's intention. Iran has very good relations with the Iraqi government. Iran, after all, will have to live with Iraq forever, really, because it's Iran's neighbor. Iran wants a stable Afghanistan. It supports the government in Afghanistan because it wants the country to remain united. Iran supports this Iraqi government because it wants Iraq to remain united and stable. It's both to the benefit of the Iranians and to the benefit of the Iraqi people. And I think that it's basically people and forces and groups and countries that wish to divide Iran and Iraq and to divide the region who make these accusations.
A final comment from Richard. Let me go back to the lingering doubt. Many people, Richard, here in this part of the world, they just absolutely refuse to believe that the United States will pack and leave by the end of December 2011.
Well, there were also a lot of skeptics concerning our intentions in Iraq, and our intentions had been from the beginning to give the Iraqi people the opportunity to stand up a democratic, representative, and accountable government, and the Iraqi people have taken advantage of that opportunity. So I'm quite confident that as we explain what our... Well, they've had elections and they have a democratic government which is responsive to the people, and I think that's a pretty good thing for Iraq and for the region.
And their country has been
what
destroyed,
we're saying, our policy,
and they still do not have independence.
Well, I would dispute that, as I would dispute just about every statement you've made in terms of the history of the region, but we're not going to get into that here. The main thing is
what we will get into it is a final comment from George Joffe. George, does SOFA leave a loophole for perhaps a prolonged and extended stay of U.S. forces?
Oh, yes, it does, because it provides for the Iraqi government to invite American forces to remain in support of the Iraqi government. And my conviction is that the problems of Iraq are not over, and that there's bound to be further conflict. And it seems to me in those circumstances, either an Iraqi government will voluntarily propose that American forces should remain, or otherwise the United States will feel that its own interests are threatened and it will actually require that it should remain. So in a sense, therefore, SOFA, the Status of a Forces Agreement, doesn't necessarily guarantee the withdrawals that President Obama anticipates. And the problem he faces too beyond that is that there's no guarantee that things follow the pattern he's dictated so far. And he must face the possibility that he may be implicated in Iraq for many, many months and years to come.
George Jofi, Richard Schmierer, Saeed Mohammed Mirandi, gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, goodbye.